All right, team. So with all the drama on the internet at the moment about the Next 14 release, I thought I'd give you a little dive into the past and see something that we've been using to build a very big business with very few resources. And I'm talking about Ruby on Rails. So what I'm going to do today is show you what it looks like in comparison to the Create T3 stack that's built on top of Next, and show you how features that we use in JavaScript land translate into Ruby world, and just share this tool that I've grown to love over the last couple of years. So let's jump in. All right, so what I am talking about today is Ruby on Rails. So Rails is a framework that's built on top of the Ruby language, which means that it's very easy to write code in very few lines. And Ruby's built to be a language that you can read. It's like a fluent sentence, right? So if you want to learn more and watch how you can build a blog app, you can jump onto rubyrails.org to find out some things there. Also, if you're going to take this further, have a look at the Ruby language and just see how it works in comparison to JavaScript. So Ruby is a dynamically typed language, so there are no types. And depending what camp you're in there's a lot of controversy around that as well. But if you like working, I guess, not battling with types the whole time, Ruby shines in that area. Obviously, I do also like types, and it's, to be fair, it's something I probably miss from Ruby, but it doesn't mean you can't be super productive. So we're going to jump in today, and we're going to have a look at some of the features that we use in the T3 stack. So I've done a few videos on this already, but the things that we use from here usually, so obviously you get your Next.js, which runs React for us, both on the front end and back end. TypeScript, so as I mentioned, TypeScript is not a thing in Ruby world. However, you can run a JavaScript front end inside of your Rails app. It does allow that, and you can run TypeScript there if you wanted to, but it's not typed front to back like we get with TRPC, all right? So TRPC is basically the endpoint that allows us to build endpoints for our routers. So you've seen me use this before. Prisma for managing our database, it's an ORM. Tailwind, which is the CSS library, and then Next.js. So these are the parts that you get with T3, and I want to show you how these parts translate in Rails. So let's jump into the first piece. All right, so starting from the top. So in JavaScript land, or in the T3 stack, we use Next.js to render our front end, as well as render our APIs. So in Rails world, what we're going to be doing here is we are going to be using Rails, obviously, as our back end. And now with Rails, we can also render views and actually everything's server rendered, right? So basically where JavaScript world is now coming back to, from client-side rendering, and we're now moving back into, server components, etc. Things like Rails and PHP have been doing this for years. So I'm going to show you how easy that is to do with the native views in Rails using the HTML and ERB. So that's the server-side rendering there. And so that'll cover us front end and back end. So Rails will just render HTML straight to the client. And that's pretty much where we're moving with React at the moment. So, and this is why I wanted to show you this option as well. And the thing with Rails as well, it's very easy to add pieces of JavaScript on top of it using all the Hotwire libraries. And also even things like Vue make it easy to add in little pieces of JavaScript where you need it. So if you need interactivity and stuff, you can add it very easily. So we'll dive into that. That's a little bit more advanced. We can dive into that later. TypeScript, like I mentioned, we don't have that thing on the back end and using native views, but you can add it if you need. TRPC. So in Rails world, we will be talking about controllers here. So this is controllers and routes. So Rails offers a route file where you can define routes very easily. And then we use controllers instead of routers. So when we dive in, I'll show you how similar they are. And then you have the option, and one of the powers of Rails is we can actually render out any format. We can render out JSON, HTML, XML, like literal files. We can render those out as well. So it's very flexible in that regard. Moving on to Prisma, the ORM in Rails is called Active Record, and it's very powerful. I actually think it writes much better SQL than Prisma does, with far fewer queries. And one of the reasons is it's very mature. It's been run for a very long time. Very, very powerful. So that's Active Record. And then Prisma also handles migrations, which Rails has an equivalent feature, which is literally just called migrations. But I think it's easier to run migrations in the future as your app becomes more complex. When you want to do renaming of columns or you want to change column types, it's very easy to do in Rails. So that's something we can look at as well. Tailwind CSS actually works in both places, so there's no change needed there. We're all good. And Next.auth. So Next.auth is obviously the authentication library that we use in the T3 stack. Rails, to add in the similar functionality, you can use a gem called device. But since Rails 7.1, they've actually introduced a whole bunch of new helpers that make it even easier to roll your own auth. And it's all with all the built-in security features that you need to do. So it's actually, I would almost argue, a little bit easier in some regards to add authentication. And there's a lot of power there. And it's very easy to add in things like OAuth using OmniAuth gems. All right, so those are the pieces we're going to cover. So let's jump in and set up your environment to get running. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to have a Ruby version. So I'm on a Mac and I'm running a piece of software called RVM. Now RVM is very similar to what we have with NVM, which is the node version manager, right? So with RVM, we have the same thing, right? So RVM is the Ruby version manager. So if we have a look at rvm.io, you can see here there's a Ruby version manager and you can install it. But basically what that allows us to do is run different Ruby versions depending on the project that you're writing. So you might inherit a legacy project, you need an older version, or if you're starting a new project, you want to run the latest Ruby. So I've installed that. I'm using Ruby 3.2.1. Now that's all good. So once you've set that up, you can go through the docs and follow that. Now to get started, we need to install Rails as a gem. So gems are basically packages. You can think similar to packages you'd find on NPM or NPX, you know, when you run NPX packages. So with Rails, what we're going to do here is we're going to say gem install Rails, right? Now I've already done this in the past, but when you run that, it will go through and install Rails. You can see here, it's successfully installed Rails 7.1.1. All right, so that's now installed. So now if I go Rails V, I can see that Rails is in the command line and I'm running Rails 7.1.1. Okay, so that's how we install Rails. Okay, so the next step is to actually create a new project. So this is very cool. This is similar to how you'd run in T3 app, you'd run npm create T3 app latest. So with the gem like Rails, we just go Rails new. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to implement similar features from my 4x4 that we've written in the T3 stack in Rails. So we're going to go my 4x4 and then we're going to say Rails. Yeah? I'm going to hit enter and we're going to let that do its thing. So it's setting up all the folder structure and it's installing the gems. Okay, so we've installed. What we can now do is we can jump into our directory. So what I want to do here is show you the folder structure of Rails. And I'll zoom in a little bit. Okay, so we're going to walk through the folder structure now of a Rails app. And maybe what I'll do is I will also pull up my 4x4, which is the T3 app, and we can have a little comparison here. All right, so on the Rails website, there is a whole bunch of documentation on what all these folders do. But the key one that we want to look at is the app, right? So this is where the actual app logic lives, and this is all our custom logic. And another folder we probably look at in a bit is DB, so it handles all our database stuff. Config can be important as well. And this is for configuration and stuff like that. The rest of the stuff, you're probably not going to have to touch too often or at all. So that's what we get there. Now, to work through the first piece, we're going to have a look at running this thing, right? So all we have to do, so I'm just going to cd into the directory. Whoops, not backwards, cd my 4x4 Rails. And all we're going to do here is run Rails S, and that stands for Rails server. So it's shorthand for that. We run that, and you can see now we're running on port 3000. So if we open up localhost 3000, there we go. So you can see here we're running our Rails app. That's booted, ready to go, right? Okay, so now the next piece that we want to have a look at is working through these folders. So assets are static assets that need to be compiled. So think your images, think your public directory inside of a Next app would be here. So anything like this, we're going to have living inside of images, yeah? And then you can have global style sheets, which we tend to avoid. I don't like that because we end up with that kind of thing. So we would use Tailwind, and we would pretty much have just overrides in here. Channels is a folder for things using WebSockets. So Rails has WebSocket support out of the box. So that's where those live in there. Controllers is a piece that we will use a lot. So Rails is an MVC framework, which is model, view, and controller. So you can see here we have controllers, models, and views. So controllers handle the request, and then depending on a model is like an entity, think model and Prisma, and then we render out a view. And that's basically the architecture here. Helpers are things that if you want to reuse certain bits of code, you can write little methods that you can use. I tend to avoid these things because I find them a little bit hard to refactor out of. Like it adds magic into some of the files, and like, where does that come from? It can be hard to go away from. JavaScript. So here's where we can write JavaScript, and this is using Stimulus, I believe. So it's using Hotwired Turbo Rails, and then you can write Stimulus controllers depending on your components. This is a very simple way of adding JavaScript to our views. It does the bare minimum. There's no magic, but it allows us to add on top of, and you write a controller. Jobs, very important. So you've seen us use background jobs before, using ingest and stuff like that, which is a little bit different in where we deploy to, functions in JavaScript, serverless functions, I should say. In Rails, we can use things like background jobs, because Rails, when you boot up a Rails server, it's constantly running. It's not a serverless environment. But a lot of people tend to run their Next apps in a similar way when they need to do certain things. So Rails, what we do here is we build two different servers. We have workers and app, and the app will delegate jobs off to the worker servers, which just constantly run jobs. So this jobs is built on top of active job here, which is basically a wrapper on top, and you can choose your job library. Mailers is email. So we can write our email services here. From there, we have models, which is our Prisma model, and then our views. So inside of our views folder at the moment, we only have a layouts directory, which you would be seeing come through now through to Next 13, which has layouts where you render content inside of a layout. So with Rails, you can build many layouts, and then you just inject inside your body. So anything that gets rendered inside of the body tag. So this is our layout, and you can create different types of layouts. So you could have an admin layout and basically a consumer or user layout. So that runs through the app directory there. So let's move on now to look at how we can set up our first model. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is a very powerful feature in Rails, and it's the generators. So with Rails, they have custom generators defined in part of the framework. So you can generate scaffold, which is which actually generates models, views, controllers. There's also, you can generate a model by itself. You can generate a controller. You can generate pretty much anything. A lot of gems include generators to do certain features, and you can also write your own, which is really cool. So what we're going to do here is we're going to generate scaffold for a project. Now, if we look at this, so we jump, all we need to do in a new tab here, I'm going to go Rails generate, which you can also use Rails G scaffold. And we're going to say we want to generate the scaffolding for project, right? So we're going to model it similar to what we have in my 4x4. If we look at model project here, and then what you can do, which is really cool as well, is you can go and define the params. So we're going to say it has a title, which is a string. It has a slug, which is a string. It has description, which is text. And we're going to say published, which is a Boolean. All right, and that's what we'll run with right now. Okay, so that's all we need. And then we're just going to hit enter, and you're going to see what's done here. All right, so what has it done? It's created a migration for us. So this is a really cool piece of walkthrough. It's created the model. It's then created tests for those things. So the test is using test unit to create tests for models. So as your project builds up, testing is super important. So in our app that we run, RealHub has over 9,000 tests, which we run, which gives you confidence when refactoring. And it's super, super important. As you build up and you want to upgrade versions or you want to change things, if you have all those tests, you can do it in confidence. What it's done here is created a new route for projects. And it's going to create, by using the resources project, it's going to create the index, create, update, delete, show all of those routes that we need. It's then going to create the project's controller. So basically a request hits a route and it goes to a specific controller and action. So that's what happens there. It's then creating all the views. So you can see what it's done here. It's created a new view for a folder called projects. It's created the index, edit, show new. It's created a form partial. So when you see an underscore like this in Rails, it means it's a partial. So think of it as a component. Think of a partial as a component. It's like where you'd have a page and then you'd have a component. And this would be the form component. And it's also created a project partial, which is what a project looks like when it's rendered in a loop. Okay, so these are very similar to components. Okay. So the next piece that it's done is created tests there. It's created a helper for the project. And then it's also set up JBuilder, which is a way we can render and build our JSON output. So this is also very cool. It's a very powerful way of building JSON. And it's done the index and show routes for us. So if you're indexing, you can do something. And if you have a show, and then it's created a partial here, again, which gets looped through when you're creating. And it's done that all in one little command. So we haven't had to do very much, and we've already got something running. So now if we just say, all right, let's jump into here and just go, what does projects look like? Okay, so we have a pending migration. So what's that saying to us? It's saying that there's a migration inside of Rails which hasn't been run in the database yet, right? It's a little catch there for us. But if you look in here, this is what's going to happen. So Rails has automatically created a new migration for us, and it's basically saying create a new table called projects. It's going to have a column of string with title. It's going to have the slug, the string. It's going to have a description of text and a Boolean of published. Now we can also say here like default false, and here we can also have null false on slug. You can't have a null title. You can't have a null title either. And then we're going to index unique true. All right. So then if we go into here and run Rails DB migrate, there we go. We can see that we're now migrating, and we've migrated that model. This is the next cool thing I really like about Rails. There aren't many ways in JavaScript frameworks to run code like this, but in Rails, we have a really cool thing called Rails console. So you just do that by typing Rails C. And this for me is magic because I use this all the time to debug code and test certain commands. If I want to test a command, it's very easy to do. It can be very difficult to do in other frameworks. I just haven't found a good way to do it. But in Rails, we run Rails C. Now what we can do here is we can say project.all. You can see our database now has projects table set up because we're not getting a crash here. So by calling project.all, it's created the query. You can say select projects all from projects table. Now, this is really powerful. And I think it's a really cool way to learn because if you don't know SQL and it's not very strong, Rails, every time you spit out a new command, it will actually show you exactly what SQL it's running. And it's all color-coded, which makes it really easy to read. So we could do something like project.where, and we could say published is true. Now you'll see here, Rails will say, cool, no worries. Projects all from projects where projects.published is equal to 1, which is the equivalent of true. And it translates active record translate into the database you're using. So if you're using Postgres or MySQL or whatever you choose, it will translate that in. And that's what an ORM does, similar to Prisma. So what we want to do here is we've inspected that it all works. We can now either create a model, like we could literally create a new project from here if we just provided all the variables. So we could say title, Ford, Raptor, etc., slug, right, and then we would say, I think that's all we require, right? So we can do that, just hit that in, and you can see it creates a transaction, and it inserts into projects all the data that we've supplied, and then it returns the model here. So we can now go project equals projects.first, and now we can inspect that project just in the command line like that. So it's a very, very good way of debugging. And I don't like to admit it, but I do use this in production sometimes to just check that everything's working, right? So with that in mind, we can now go back to our project's route. We've run our migration. We need to run our server. So I'll exit console and I'll run Rails S. Now if we refresh, there we go. Now you can see here, we are rendering out our projects and we've got a little partial. So we got each record is here. So we've got the title thing, description, published, show this project. So now we've got the route here, which is the projects 1 with the ID there. We can edit the project. Like we haven't done anything. We ran one command and we can now say, is my daily driver, we can publish this. Project was updated. Now you can see it's published true. We can go back to projects. Boom, look at that. So you can see here, we've scaffolded up controllers, models, routes, everything in one line. And this is the power of Rails. It allows us to do a lot of work very, very quickly, which I would say it would be a big struggle to do in any other project, to get that up and running that fast, right? So what it allows us to is get the basic scaffolding, which is what it's called, out of the way. Then we can go and modify this how we want to very quickly, right? So it's even got the new project set up here. So you got your CRUD, you create, read, update, destroy, all here, like destroys here, you know, it's all happy days. See, so I'm gonna add one back in just so that we have it. Now, obviously in a production application, you'd want like a notification, which you can add a confirmation. It's very easy to do. So moving forward, let's look at our views. Okay, so before we move on, I'm now going to show you the other pieces of scaffold that were created when we ran that command, because I think it's very important to know where all these things live. So firstly, inside of config, we have a file called routes. And this is where you define your routes, right? So in Next, what we do is we have source, and then this is an older app, so it's running the pages directory, but the pages directory is our routing. So it's folder-based routing. And that's cool, and that works. But in Rails, what we do is we define our routes in a file like this. And it's quite powerful and very flexible. So what you can see here it added in this resources projects. Okay? Now what does that do? So if we open up our code here and we run Rails routes, it's going to spit out every route that Rails has available to us. So I'm making this super wide so you can see it all. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here that's just built into the framework. So Action Mailbox, which is a really cool feature. You can see here, it handles inbound email, which is super cool. So if you want users to be able to reply to, let's say you sent out someone added a comment, you want to hit reply, you can process that email and then create a comment from there. So that's a super cool feature. It's built into Rails, called Action Mailbox. Then it also has its active storage. So this is for basically handling file storage with any provider that you choose. And it's a wrapper on top. You can install Rails without these things. So just out of the box it comes there, but if you don't want them, you can ignore them. And look here, we've even got a Rails up, which is a really cool. We've got it built in from the beginning. We've got a Rails up. Right? Green. Yep, great. It's all good. So we're running. But where we added our code is this. Right? So you can see here, we've got get endpoint at projects, which routes to projects index. We've got a post endpoint to projects, which does projects create. So this is following a RESTful pattern. We've got projects new, which basically shows you the form. It's got the edit form here. It's got the actual show route. And you can very easily see where that goes. And then it's got patch for update, and it aliases patch and put both to the update route, and then it's got a delete endpoint there. Okay, so with that in mind, so what do we look for? So now we're saying, okay, I want to go to the page that shows me the index. So where do we go? So to get there, we're going to go into our app. We're going to go to controllers. We're going to go to projects controller. And here you go. So here's the controller that the scaffolding did. So you can see here, so we're looking for, it's even got the comments of exactly where those routes go. And the really cool thing about the scaffolding that's happening here is we can see projects 2, which is rendering the HTML. Or if we just add JSON, we get the JSON. So this is ready to go for your mobile app or a different, let's call it a different kind of application that needs to consume JSON. You know, if you're building your front end on, let's call it React or something, and you were using a library like React Query to fetch data, you can fetch it as JSON and it's just done. It's all finished for you and it's all rendering out here. It's got all the stuff we need and it's all happy days. So this is the endpoint here that so that was the show endpoint, sorry, that we were looking at just then. If we go back one to, let's just go to projects, the index route here, which is this. And what it's doing is it's setting this variable here. And what is it equal to? Project.all. So what we could do is we could say, well, on my front end, I only want to see projects.where published is true. And you can do ordering, you can do paging or pagination, but we're going to leave it as all for now. And then the cool thing about Rails is you can then go and authorize these endpoints individually. So depending on the current user that's logged in, you can then go and define, similar to how TRPC has the authenticated piece, you can do exactly the same thing in Rails. And then one of the things that it's doing here, you can see before action. So what that means is before any of these are run, we want to run set project. And then it has this conditional only for show, edit, update, and destroy. Okay, so it wants to set the projects, basically like what project are we interacting with, right? And that is this piece down the bottom here. And it's saying project is equal to project.find where the parameters are ID, right? So project parameters, so if we went to here, this is the parameter in here. And that's project ID. And you can see that inside of our Rails routes. You can see here when we hit the get route, you can see this little colon ID. That's the variable from the parameters in the URL that it's going to grab. Okay, so think, if you're coming from Next.js, what are you thinking about? We're thinking about these square brackets here. So we have pages project slug, right? So that would be just the project slug. Or if we, let's say we went to something a bit simpler, maybe posts or even projects here. This is if we're going one-to-one. So in next land, we would have projects, project ID. That parameter there is equivalent to this ID here. And that comes out of the URL here. So this is the difference between the two routing types, okay? So now that we have that, we can see that's where we're getting the ID, and then it's finding the project and setting a variable here that you can access across all these methods, right? So before it runs anything, it sets project to this, and that means you can then use it inside of all of these endpoints, and Rails will inject that in for you. So for instance, let's go to the show route. It looks like it's doing nothing here. So this is part of the Rails magic, and it's when you go convention over configuration. We know, because we're hitting a show route, that our view for this will live inside of projects, which is the controller, and then show, okay? And you can see we're using that variable right here. So it's going to render a project, and which is we're getting from here. So whatever project.find is, it will render that. And then it's going to have a link to edit project, which is edit project path. And this is a helper. So this is automatically going to grab the correct route, which I actually really, really like. These helpers are so powerful because if you change the route, this will automatically pick that up. The problem with any other app, if we hard code URLs, it's very hard to go and refactor if we ever change. So using these helpers can be very handy. And this will always route to project's path. And then it's got the destroy button here. Now, if we look for this project, it's rendering this one. So you can see here we have the JBuilder, the JSON version, and we have the HTML version. And you can have different versions for every like basically content type you please. So we're rendering out a new div with the DOM ID set to project. So let's see what that looks like. What does that look like actually in code? So we are in the show. If we go in here and inspect, Rails is rendering a DOM ID project_2. So it keeps track of this. And then you can see here we've got just P tags, P, and if you look at our source, PPP, right? So that's all coming through right there. Okay, so if we were like, I actually don't want to show if it's published here, I can just do that, and it's gone, right? So this is how we can control our partials or our components. If you're going to come back from React, it would be equivalent to having projects, and then in Next.js, we usually have a components folder, and then we have a project, and then inside of that, we would have the actual project itself, right? So this is equivalent to that. The JSON for JBuilder lives here. It's basically a little syntax to write and loop through. So we're looping through all our projects, and then we're finding the partial, which lives inside of project, and we're saying whatever the loop that comes out of this loop, we're going to name it project, okay? So we can now see that in the JBuilder, we are expecting a variable called project, and we're extracting these properties out of it. And for us, we're like, nah, I don't want to show, like if you had a secret variable, let's say you had password, you could just remove it from here. And then what this is doing is setting the URL property to the project URL format JSON. So if you had a look at our example before, the URL is being set right there. And that's really cool for production because it actually shows you where that piece of view came from or what route you hit to get that. It's basically the self reference that you might see in some JSON. So that's all cool. So what's next? So we will have a look at, what else is there that we need to have a look at? We've got projects, we've got views, we've got models there. So what we can do next, and I think just to make it feel a little bit more real life is, suddenly you had the screen. What does it look like to style the screen? with Tailwind. So let's jump into that. Cool. So one thing, you can see the Rails really actually supports Tailwind out of the box. We could have created a new application with CSS set to Tailwind, and it would have just done the work for us. It would have just come similar to T3 Stack, would have just come with it, right? But if we're adding Tailwind later, what we can see here is run bin bundle, but we can actually just run bundle, add Tailwind CSS Rails. So let's close this, stop the app running, and then we're going to run bundle add Tailwind CSS Rails. So it's adding that to our gem file, which is probably something I should touch on. So I'm going to close all these off. The gem file is basically our package.json that you're used to in JavaScript world. And it just says all the dependencies that we have, right? So you can see them all very nicely laid out here and what we use. So if we needed to add Redis, we can add that in. If we wanted to add some bcrypt, we could do it here very easy by uncommenting. If we want to do variants in active storage, we can do it. They've got basically defaults defined, some for development, some for test. And now you can see we've just run bundle add Tailwind CSS. So it's installed version 2 for us. The next thing that it says to us is install. We need to run the Tailwind installer. So we're going to run Rails Tailwind CSS install. And that's just going to do, basically, it's a generator, I imagine, and it's inserting some things into the layouts application HTML. So let's have a look at what it's done. So if we jump into our views, layouts, application, and you can see here, it's added in Tailwind. All right, so it's added in the style sheet for Tailwind. It's probably created a Tailwind style sheet, and it has. We can see that there. So it's importing the base, the components, and the utilities. So that's cool. What else has it done for us? So it inserted there. It's inserted into the assets build. So it's assets builds, Tailwind. So it's basically, I think this is the condensed version of, sorry, the compressed version of Tailwind CSS right there. What else have you done for us? It's created our config Tailwind config. So like I said before, any configuration lives inside of config, and then we're going to have Tailwind config. So this is our default JS file for Tailwind, which you would be familiar with. If you're using it in another project, you would have seen exactly the same thing here. And then we're telling it what content to watch for actual Tailwind classes. What else do we have? It's got this one. It's created a proc file. Okay, here. So it's basically when we run our app, we want to also run Tailwind CSS watch so that it can compile the new Tailwind every time we add it. And then foreman. Cool. So now what it's saying, what is it saying? What's this? To complete rebuilding, bundle install. Awesome. So we've all installed there now. Now let's have a look here. So that's it. That's the install. So if we run Rails S, I'm just wondering if we need to run using the new file. It says compile initial Tailwind build. So let's see if we can actually use this. We're going to jump in here. We are going to go to our projects. We're going to go to the index file, and we're going to say class equals, I'm coming from React here and I'm trying to write class name in my head. Let's say, we're going to say text. I need my Tailwind cheat sheet because I'm not actually that good on Tailwind. Font weight, so font bold. And then we're going to say font size. We're going to say text large. See if that is doing, we need to run Rails server before I forget that. We've done that. Okay, let's go. There it is. So it's added in its default styling here, you can see already. So what we need to do, because this isn't wrapped in any container, we need to do that. So what we can say, so it's saying here container mx auto. So it's actually added some classes to our main here. And let's see what it's done. So if we look here, so this is the main class. It's given margin top of 28. So we're like, we don't need that, chief. We don't need this. It's trying to, it looks like it's trying to center the content, centering it a little bit into the side with a little bit of padding. So we can, let's see, what does it look like? So we really need to wrap our stuff in here. Let's go a div, and we're going to go class equals flex col. All right, we'll just tab that in. So flex column. I have a feeling I'm not running Tailwind. So I think we need to actually run Tailwind. Here we go. So we can also run bin dev. Okay, so this is probably the way, when you use Tailwind in Rails, what we want to run is bin dev. And that's going to start that with that proc file that I was talking about earlier here. And what that says is going to run the web, which is going to run Rails server on port 3000. It's also going to run the CSS process, which is Tailwind watch. Now, you could run Rails S in one tab and in another tab Rails Tailwind CSS watch. But you can see here we're running this now inside of both processes in one window. Okay. Now what we should see is, there we go. So now our Tailwind's compiling and we're actually getting our column output. So let's go back. So now we can see we can actually style. I'm not going to go, this is not a styling run, but we can go through here. Let's get rid of this nonce. So we're sitting in the corner there. Now with the container, we can say width, and we can go into Tailwind and say, what do we have? Width is, so width is 100% in mobile. So we're going to say width W full. But in a large screen, we want to have a width of, let's call it, I don't know, what do we have here? Maybe, let's, 24 rem. Let's go width half screen. All right. So let's see what that looks like. There we go. So now we're running halfway through, and we can now go in here. We're probably going to go like 2XL for the font here. Yep. And we're going to say on top here, we want a margin top of 16. What I'm just trying to illustrate here is basically we are running Tailwind, we're running it inside of Rails, and we can build whatever we need to. I would suggest, if you're interested in using Tailwind inside Rails, the creator of Tailwind actually did a really good keynote at Rails World. So Adam Wathan showed off some really cool examples of how to use Tailwind in Rails. So have a look at that. But I just want to quickly show you, this is how we can style very quickly and actually render out some content. Okay, so the other pieces that I haven't touched yet is Next.js. So that's device. So that's for handling authentication, which I'll do in another video. But so far, what you can see here is we've basically ticked off most of these things, obviously without TypeScript. But we've shown how we can build an application which you'd see in Next. And we've done this very, very quickly. And realistically, we've done it in one command. I'm showing you things as I walk through, which drags this video out a little bit. But you can see how fast you can actually just build things in Rails. What I do want to just touch on before we finish is the actual model. And I think models are very powerful in Rails. Because not only is the model the definition of the actual entity in the database, but it also gives you a whole bunch of functionality. So one of the cool things that I like in Rails, and some people don't like these things, but I really do, is validations. So think about things that we use Zod for in the JavaScript world. These things you can just add in Rails model, very simple. So you can see that Copilot here, if I just hit tab, you can see that it's added these validates. And there's a whole bunch of active record validations that you can get straight out of the box. So you don't have to worry about trying to think. So you could say validates title, you can validate for regex, you can do a whole bunch of things. And this, before it ever saves a model, it will check that these validations are correct. And if not, it will throw an error. So that it has the ability to define relationships. So this is similar to what you'd see in Prisma, where we have things like these project likes, right? So a project has many project likes. So what we could say here is project likes, right? And then dependent destroy. So this is a very powerful feature as well. Whenever we kill the project, it kills all the likes and all its children that have this flag. Another really cool thing is the after commit. There's a whole bunch of hooks. You can do certain things. So we could say after project was created, we can then, like, let's say send welcome email, right? And then all you do, on create. And then what we do inside of here, we have a private method and we just go def there, and then we can have our mailer. So we'd say project mailer, welcome email, deliver later. So that would be queued. So that's how simple it would be to basically, after creating something, send an email. And in my 4x4, you would have noticed in our JavaScript version, to do the same thing is a lot of work and a lot of duplicate code. So even if we extract the code into a method, you still have to remember to add that method every single time. Like if you do a create, if you do an update. So one of the things was activity. Whenever we created a new record, we had to create an activity. And to do that was a lot more work, a lot more code. Another thing that I want to quickly highlight that's really cool in Rails is when you add filters. So think index route. Think if you want to say like if params string. So if we pass up a string, we want to filter. So we can check that it's present. Then we can say projects is equal to projects.where. And then you could say like title is the string. Like obviously you'd use an I like or something here to make a comparison, but you can add and append to the query before it's run. So you would have seen inside of my 4x4, inside of our TRPC routers, when we fetch, let's say something like a post, if we look for this, get post, right? To add the similar functionality, we say, okay, well, if the category is set, we have to push in filters and we have to do the sum and all this nonsense, unfortunately. And that's the Prisma API, but you have to like push in filters into the object and then pass that object. You can see how many lines of code this is to write basically, I mean, how many do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different filters. In Rails, those would basically be 3 lines each, or you could even do them as one-liners like this, right? You could say, yeah, this is for string. And then you could say for, do you know what I mean? So it's very, very easy to work with active record and filtering. It's one of the very powerful features in Rails, and we use this all the time. And it's so easy when you try to compare it to other frameworks. This is the way. So Rails as an API is amazing. It's just going to come down to whether or not you like to use the views. But I mean, if the world's moving towards server rendering and everyone wants server rendering, why wouldn't you use them? There is the ability, like I said, to add JavaScript on top. You could initialize, you could install React with React Rails and you get server rendering and Rails support all built in. Or you can just add JavaScript sprinkles on top of your HTML, which is kind of where we're heading. It's where we're heading. So I would strongly recommend you have a look at Rails. I'm really enthusiastic and I'm really pumped. I've been using this for probably 8 years now and built a business with it. It was our stack choice, and I would still, for any large project, I would just lean straight into this. I show a lot of JavaScript stuff purely because I'm learning it and I want to see what's out there, but I still haven't found a framework that is as powerful as Rails to use moving forward. There's so many things that are just built in. Like one of the really awesome features is encryption. You can add encryption to your Rails projects so easily. And what I'll do is I will create videos on all of these subjects moving forward. So I'm going to show you how to in the upcoming videos, I'll show you how to add in third-party authentication. So if you're using something like Kind or Sierra, I'll show you how to set that up, process JWTs. There's also the ability to spool Rails up as an API only. So you don't worry about the views and stuff. You can just spool up API only. It bypasses a few things and it can run a little bit quicker. Rails has things like caching built in out of the box. Very easy to add. You can partial cache like little pieces of JSON. So when you're looping through, you can cache all that, pull it out of Redis. And they've just introduced new solid cache, which is going to store into the DB. So Rails is moving forward. They didn't disappear. And I'm really excited to see what the future holds for it. There's a whole bunch of things I want to dive in and actually explore. So let me know in the comments if you want to see more. And if you give it a spin, I want to hear what you think, what your thoughts. Tell me what the pros are, what the cons are. I just want to hear what you guys think. And I will catch you on the next one.